Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Central Zoo Authority, I welcome everyone to episode 19 of Zooming Conservation, a podcast series that highlights critical efforts in wildlife conservation. Today we are focus. Today we are focusing on unique and fascinating topics: reptile management and captivity. Our guest expert for this episode is someone who has dedicated over 25 years of understanding and conserving reptiles, making a significant contribution in this field. We are thrilled to welcome Gerard Martin, a seasoned expert who has begun his journey at Madras Crocodile Bank Trust under the legendary Romulus Whittaker. Gerry's early work include the remarkable feat of successfully breeding and raising king cobras in captivity for the first time in India. He has since worked with wide range of reptiles and amphibians, both in captivity and wild. Currently based in Karnataka, Gerry's focus has shifted to addressing India's snakebite crisis. He leads pioneering ecological and behavioral research of snakes, which has direct impact on venom research and snakebite management. In addition, he is spearheading the development of a serpentarium that will not only conduct vital research but also provide high quality venom free of charge for antivenom production. We are excited to learn about the reptile management and handling in captivity from your extensive experience in the field of reptile conservation and zoo management. Over to you.
Thank you, Apurva. I'm just going to share my screen. Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone's well. Um, is this presentation visible to everyone?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So I guess we'll spend the next hour or so speaking about reptiles in captivity, which is unfortunately a field that is neglected all globally, but when you compare to all the other more charismatic species. Um, but personally, I find reptiles to be amongst the most charismatic species if we give them a chance. So, to begin with, I think it's really important for us to also realize that reptiles are animals just like any other animal, and they are also living beings. And even though they might not express themselves the way we are used to, um, they still they still are able to communicate to us in a way that is familiar to them that we have to learn. And we have to think of them as living beings while they are in captivity, especially. Now, for zoos especially, I think it's very important that in many parts of the world, in fact, what happens and in India, what happens is that, especially with reptiles, a lot of animals are sort of dumped on the zoos. So there are people who bring in animals or an animal is caught somewhere and there's no other place to put it, so it gets put in the zoo. So these things make it quite difficult. Fortunately, the CZA also has the whole rescue center and rehabilitation centers that are separate. Um, but for a zoo planning a reptile collection, there's a few very important questions to ask. One is, why do we need to have that animal in captivity? Two, what is needed for that animal and for us to be able to keep it well? And finally, how do we actually manage everything that animal needs and requires to live not just a healthy but also a meaningful, I'd like to use the term happy, just a happy life in captivity. So the first thing that we look at why. We look at, does this animal need conservation support? Is there ex situ breeding required? Is there research required? There are a lot of reptiles that are highly dependent now on external conservation practices. So these are definitely species that could be in zoos. Also, an animal that needs a lot of conservation is also needs a lot of outreach, so people have to connect with it. So is it something that is of educational value, and that could be either an endangered species or a species that's more iconic. So for example, having a large crocodile or a king cobra also has the appeal and you're able to engage people with it. So some this could also be a good reason to keep an animal as an exhibit in a zoo. And finally, of course, research. Zoos have a fantastic potential for research, and it would be great to be able to churn out more and more behavioral, ecological, and husbandry based research from zoos in our country. So the first question is what species are relevant to your particular collection, your particular zoo? Who is your audience? What is the best message you can get out? What is most required? Uh, that also it needs to be a species that you have the capacity to care for well. So prior to bringing the animal in, a lot of study has to be done, research has to be done to understand what the requirements of that animal are or could be. So especially for Indian reptiles, unfortunately, there's there's a lack of anything for us to fall back on. We don't have in America, for example, if you want to buy a snake, even if it's any of their native snakes, you can go in some states if it's legal, you can buy it, and then you can just go to Google and have everything that you need that snake requires that you need to provide for that snake. So unfortunately, in India, we do not have these baseline requirements for many of our animals. There's also very little research that's done on reptiles in the wild, so we don't really know what they truly require. Much of what we do is sort of speculative. So we need to really figure out what we need to bring in and whether we have the wherewithal and the just the facilities to be able to take care of it. And of course, ideally, it needs to be specimens that will do well in the climate that we're in. So you really don't want to have like a desert animal in the outdoors in, say, like a high humidity or a high rainfall space. It just leads to a whole lot of issues, both medical, husbandry based, and general animal health as well. And finally, of course, I mean, whichever authority in India, it is the Central Zoo Authority, whichever species are recommended or mandated need to be followed. This is just I just put together a hypothetical list of species and how we could actually make decisions about whether we wanted to keep these kind of species or not. So if you have, so Crocodylus palustris is the mugger crocodile. It's a widespread crocodilian, and it has definite conservation purpose as well as education purpose, as do most of the other crocodilian species. The water monitor lizard, again, is not just conservation and education, but it's also has a lot of appeal. Uh, but if you look at the end, there are larger animals like the giant Aldabra tortoise or African spur-thigh tortoise, which are actually exotics, but have huge exhibit value. But just above that is the Asian giant tortoise, which has a huge conservation value as well. So it's good to be able to put these things down and be able to decide which species we truly want to keep and which species should and shouldn't be in the collection. A species like the Indian chameleon, for example, can be kept in a really engaging way. It brings in a lot of education value. It also, there's a lot of husbandry research that needs to be done on it because it's not really kept in most collections because it is slightly difficult to keep in captivity. When we talk about how we're going to keep the animals, it's really important to start with, where we're keeping them, the design and how we build the enclosures. And that involves everything from, the kind of substrate that there is, the material that's used to build the enclosure itself, what kind of access we have to it, how will, what are the systems that will be at play within the enclosure? Will we be able to drain the water from inside, or does it need to be drained from outside? What are the safety measures that are required if it's a dangerous animal? If it's not a dangerous animal, does it have, for example, is there a chance of escape? Is it a fast-moving animal? So then, what kind of fenestration is required? So all these thoughts need to be put into actually, bringing together the enclosure itself. And for all reptiles, it's very, very important to give them a large range of everything from temperature to light to humidity. And it's not enough to give them a large amount of light with a high temperature and a dry humidity that then goes to a darker area with a lower temperature and high humidity. We need to give them all different kinds of permutations as well. So sometimes they need a high humidity low light. Sometimes they might need high humidity and high light. Sometimes they might need a different spectrum of light. It might be more important for them to have infrared, or it might be more important for them to have UV. So it's important to figure out what exactly is required for the animal and then give them a wide range for them. Obviously, we also have to ensure feed supply before we actually bring the animal in. Now, when we're looking at enclosure design, uh, it's we tend to look at enclosures that look nice, and that is very important, especially for a zoo. It's very important that it is an engaging space. The animal needs to be visible relatively easily, but it needs to be visible without putting the animal under stress. So the animal should also feel secure, and there are various ways of doing that. The animal, unfortunately, if the animal is given a hide, especially with many reptiles, uh, and especially snakes and lizards, they will go into that hide and stay there. So the way to actually so you can either use the enclosure itself, or you can use various practices like training or a change in temperature and all to ensure that the animal is more active. Uh, Keeper access is a key point to think about and finalize, uh, both from the point of view of ease. If things are difficult for a keeper to do, it becomes difficult for that keeper to do the same thing every day. So if for example, cleaning is required, and cleaning is required almost every day in most enclosures. So it's very important to make sure that that cleaning process is made easy. So for that purpose, it's good to not have too giant an enclosure or too small an enclosure. It's important that the furniture inside the enclosure isn't cramped, and the keeper can move around easily and safely. It's also very important to ensure that the keeper can stay safe while concentrating on cleaning and maintenance. So whether that involves, having a separate enclosure that the animal is moved to, or a hide box that the animal is closed in, any of these things, just to ensure keeper safety as well. Um, and then systems are really important. You could have automated systems for lighting, temperature, humidity, things like water flow, filtration. And also there are practical systems like how is this space taken care of? Do we need to clean the glass? How often do we need to clean the glass? Uh, if the glass is to be cleaned, is it accessible easily and safely? So, and then finally, like I said, lighting, temperature, and humidity are really, really important, and they cannot be standardized. Each species has different requirements. And when I say each species, I don't mean snakes have a different requirement from crocodiles. I mean, each species of crocodile has a different requirement. Each species of snake has a different requirement. Sometimes some of these animals have different requirements seasonally and even through their life. So if they're younger, they might have different requirements, and as they're older, they might have different requirements. So it's very important to take inspiration from wild habitats where these animals are found. But simply trying to visually recreate the habitat is not enough. We need to figure out what kind of substrates are possible. And temperature and light spectrum is something that we're only just beginning to understand. In fact, not so long ago, it was found that infrared radiation is very important for especially larger reptiles, even in the absence of UV. UVA and B we know is very, very important for the health and metabolism for lizards, crocodiles, and tortoises, and to a certain extent snakes as well. Without UVB, they suffer. They can't process calcium very well, and they suffer from what's called a metabolic bone disease. So, but infrared is also very important for their day-to-day metabolism. And without that, they don't digest food very well. The immunity drops, and so it's important to give them a very healthy and real life spectrum of light as well. Um, Ideally, if we can replicate things like precipitation and humidity, that also helps a bit. Finally, furnishing is not finally, sorry, and furnishing is also very important. Personally, I'm a big fan of natural furnishing, so plants, mosses, rocks. Uh, but it's not always possible, especially for larger animals or some destructive animals. Monitor lizards, for example, can be incredibly destructive with furniture. So something stronger is required as well. But giving them a bioactive enclosure is truly it truly improves the health of reptiles tremendously. So but the bioactive enclosure also makes it harder for maintenance. So it's harder to keep the plants alive, harder for cleaning, but it does it is with the right systems a much better way to keep animals as well, especially snakes. When we talk about lighting, unfortunately, historically, a lot of places will just use your standard old tungsten incandescent bulb, and this is not enough at all. In fact, that gives them warmth, but and for the short period, for a few months or maybe a year or so, that might be fine. But especially if we have young animals and especially tortoises and lizards, it's very important for them to get some sort of natural light or at least a full daylight spectrum for all diurnal species. Nocturnal species generally need more infrared than UV, but for diurnal species they need a very high amount of UVA and B, and it depends on the kind of place they are in. So places, for example, like rainforest species of lizards will need about 2 to maybe 3% of UVB. But then desert species, like the diurnal desert species, will need about 9 to 12% UVB as well. So it's very important to figure out what species it is, how it lives, and then replicate that kind of light spectrum for them. For desert species, or at least arid species, mercury vapor lights work very well. Uh, Fortunately, today there's a lot of options even on the open market. Even on something like Amazon, you can get a lot of lights that, but be very careful about. There's a lot of fraudulent ones as well. So buy a good brand, and if you have a collection of reptiles, it might be really good to get a thing called a solar meter. There is one that also measures UV A and B separately. So if you can get that, it's a great tool to have while you're designing your enclosure and figuring out lighting. Now we all know about reptiles basking, and they bask for various reasons. It's not just for temperature and not just to metabolize their food. Uh, Everything from their skin health. Very many turtles, for example, if you see turtles in the wild, freshwater turtles, will come up onto land and bask in sometimes in the hottest time of the day, in temperatures of 40, 45 degrees even. And that's because they need to completely dry themselves off so that algal formation doesn't start under their shell or on their bodies. And these are things that also help things like snakes to improve their immune system. When we studied Russell's vipers in the wild, we had transmitters in Russell's vipers, and the transmitters were temperature sensitive. So we could, based on the number of beats per minute, we could calculate what the body temperature of the snake was. And for extended periods of time, we found that many of these Russell's vipers were maintaining their body temperatures at 36 and 37 degrees centigrade. And that's a temperature that we never expected, but they do seem to need it. And that seems to really help them fight off fungal infections, fight off bacterial infections. It helps keep the endoparasitic load under check. That's why these animals need at least the option to find a really hot space to be in. But we can't decide for them, so it's not like we can basically keep the entire enclosure at 36 degrees centigrade. We need to give them the option of that, and we need to give them an option to retreat to as well. How we do the temperature is also quite important. We use in places we have to use heating. So in most parts of India, through the summer, you definitely don't need heating, but you might need some level of cooling in some places, or at least a cooler option. But even when it's warm, it's really important for them to have a place where they can go to that is hot and dry, hot and wet. So they have these options as well. So combining temperature and humidity and all these things are very, very important. And these are decisions based on how the animal lives, and understanding their behavior prior to these decisions is very, very important. This is just showing the spectrum of light that is required. When we get to feed, unfortunately, there isn't a one size fits all for reptiles. Uh, but it's also when you think about vegetarian lizards, for example, the same kind of leaves or vegetables is not okay for all of them, or even for something like tortoises. If you have a forest dwelling tortoise like a Travancore tortoise versus an arid region tortoise like a star shell tortoise, their food requirements are quite different. How much sugar they can process are quite different. The kind of roughage they need is quite different. So for a star-shell tortoise, for example, you need a lot more leafy greens uh, and um, and grasses, and even things like alfalfa hay occasionally and things like that. But for a Travancore tortoise, they need a lot more fruit in their diet. They will even eat carrion in the wild, so giving them some way of getting a higher protein amount in their diet every now and then is also important. So it's very important to figure out exactly what the species, how the species lives in the wild, and consequently how it will grow. The picture here is a centipede eating snake. It's not from India, but it's just the point that there are some species that are so specialized that nothing else will really work. Having said that, it is also possible to train some animals to feed on other things. So, for example, king cobras have been trained to feed on rats in captivity. And they use a process called olfactory manipulation, where you make the rats smell like snakes and look like snakes, and tempt the king cobra to feed on the rats. But no one has ever done any research about whether that affects the long-term health of the snake. We don't quite know yet. So that's something that needs to be thought of in advance as well. In the feed, do we need to give supplements, calcium, deworming, vitamin A sometimes, things that are um not easily available in farm-grown food. Our captive sources of food are usually captive bred as well. It's very important also to make sure that what we're feeding them isn't production line food. So there aren't steroids, antibiotics, and pesticides even in the food that we give our animals. So ideally, if possible, we should be growing our own food to be feeding the animals so that we can be 100% sure of what we're feeding them. Now, maintenance is something that is of utmost importance, and it is one of the most tedious things to do with any form of captive husbandry of an animal. But especially for reptiles, unfortunately, what happens without everyday meticulous maintenance, two things go wrong. The first one is that we will trigger off smaller infections that will grow for no reason. They could have just been taken care of in the first place. Secondly, without checking on our animals regularly, we don't see changes. And unfortunately, with reptiles, unless you're looking very carefully, they might look fine for a long time and suddenly plummet. But if you look carefully at them, you'll see that there are some small changes. It could be they're not moving as much. It could be slightly, a slight mucus secretion from the mouth. It could be watery eyes. It could be drier skin or wrinkled scales. Any of these things are really, really good to check on. And the way to do it is to actually do your maintenance every day. The picture on the right is one of a snake mite, and mites can be catastrophic for animals like snakes. Even if we deal with the mite, sometimes it leads to subsequent infections, and things like mite infestations also cause a lot of stress and eventually hypoglycemia and all with snakes. So it's really important to make sure that we're watching out for these things very carefully all the time. Now, when we're monitoring, we need to check for diseases, of course, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, but also checking systems, everything from the door hinges to the switches, to the bulbs if they're working. Is there wire sticking out anywhere? It's very, very important to see, um, that everything is working well. Interactions between the animals is of key importance, because animals could be doing fine for the longest time, and suddenly, because of, it could be a change in the environment, it could be a seasonal behavioral change, they start attacking each other, and these interactions, these negative interactions, can actually be fatal. So it's very important to make sure that we're watching out for these. And these interactions could be something as simple as tortoises sparring too much, and the larger tortoise turning the smaller tortoise over, which, if it gets turned over in, say, a pond or something like that, the tortoise will drown and die. So it's really important to make sure that all these things are watched over regularly and quite meticulously. Now, as far as monitoring goes, it is a very good practice to look at fecal samples, uh, primarily, of course, the consistency and everything, to look for infections, but also to look for infestations, any endoparasitic infestations. And there's a wealth of information online and in many of the veterinary books on reptilian endoparasites. So just doing microscopy regularly, every individual stool should be checked at least once every couple of months, so that you don't fall too far behind and you're not suddenly faced with a giant infestation. Then, of course, there's, how you showcase your animals. Uh, there's creating the experience. Personally, I feel is really great, and many people do it with uh, by sort of showcasing a wild space. But within the enclosures, it's also I think it's very useful, not just for the public but also for the animal, for them to have. You can see this is one long enclosure here, and it's got different kinds of substrate. It's got different kinds of backdrop with perches, different kinds of plants. So there's a lot of possibility for the animal. Now, over the last few years, the word enrichment has fortunately become quite a catchphrase. Uh, Enrichment with furnishing is wonderful, and it makes a huge difference. But every animal, just like us, will get bored with the same furniture there all the time. So it stops being enrichment after some time. And yes, this is much better than a plain empty enclosure. But we could also use, as opposed to just the furniture, also use stimulus for enrichment. And stimulus could be, the scent of prey without actually feeding them. It could be a change in the temperature or humidity gradient within the enclosure. If the gradient has been going from left to right for some time, change it so that the highest point is in the middle suddenly. Change lighting cycles, uh, flood the place sometimes. Any of these things would create stimulus, and there is nothing that as useful as making the animal have to think and survive. Uh, Routine and just the same old thing every day actually cuts down the animal's ability to even metabolize well. So it's good for them to be able so not be able to, but to have to sort of survive as best as they can within as wild a setting as possible. So I'm showing this as not a good practice. You can see the bulbs are exposed the animal can actually reach the bulb if it jumps onto it. This could either cause the bulb to shatter, or it could burn the animal. So ideally, any of these things should be caged in, or I prefer to, if it's possible for them to have, be put into a recess with a mesh in front, so that the animal cannot get to it. Electrical fittings as well need to be secured. You'll find that reptiles, things like monitor lizards and all, can be real Houdinis and will really dig at things and prod at things to try and get to them. So ensure that the animals are kept safe. I think that's it for now. If we can go into if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a wonderful presentation. Am I audible?
Yes.
I request participants, if they have any questions, they can unmute themselves or write it in chat box, and I can take your questions. But till then, okay, we have Naeem Akhtar sir saying very good talk.
Thank you, sir.
But till then, I can take some questions. Like I introduced initially, you worked a lot with captive breeding of pimp quota.
Yes.
So can you give your
So,
experiences about it, as you were
so
the first person to do it?
well, I was part of a team, yes. It was with Rom Whitaker as well. And there were a couple of other people who worked with us as well. But this was in 1996 where we bred king cobras for the first time in India and successfully raised them as well. But again, we thought that everything that we did at that time was correct, but something as simple as the temperature that we were maintaining the king cobras at wasn't as much as they need. So we were very worried that high temperatures would kill the snakes. So we never let the temperature go past 30 degrees centigrade. We But when we tracked king cobras in the wild in Agumbe, we found that males were keeping their temperatures at 34 degrees centigrade for entire afternoon sometimes. So they need that as well. But what was very interesting with the king cobra breeding was we trained the king cobras to feed on rats then as well, and some of them, so individual personalities sort of come out when you're doing these things. So, and king cobras are a species that have very interesting personalities. Uh, so some of them took to it very quickly, some didn't. And when we bred the king cobras, we had 29 babies, and so I had to, because they didn't know how to eat baby mice, I had to basically hold them and feed them every day. So I would do them in batches. So I would do about 6 or 7 every day, and then rotate them. And some of them within 2 or 3 months started feeding on the mice by themselves, and a couple of them took over a year to start feeding on the mice. So, but it's and many of them actually lived for a very long time. One king cobra uh, that had actually come from, if I remember right, it was from the Ahmedabad Zoo, and it was already an adult there. It was there for 10 years, and then it was given to the Madras Crocodile Bank Trust in 1995 or 96, yeah, and then it survived till 2010. So very, very old snake. So that's the other thing. These animals should live for much longer than we think they do.
How long is the tentative age of reptiles or snakes, if we talk particularly?
So if we're talking about pythons, for example, should live for at least 50 or 60 years. Sorry, 40 or 50 years in captivity. But something like a checkered keelback water snake, I would assume would be about 15 to 18 years. So yeah, it varies.
Dr. Satyanarayan Mishra sir has question for you.
Sure.
Can you suggest feeding strategy for newly hatched pythons? How long they can
Sorry, I
survive
didn't
without
get that.
food? Can you suggest feeding strategy for newly hatched pythons? How long can they survive without food after being hatched?
Oh, okay. Yes, I can see the question.
Yeah. Even as
Yeah, so newly hatched pythons can sometimes be problematic. In fact, newly hatched snakes have many.
so you lost your connection. Uh, there seems to be some technical issue from his end. Uh, Gerry got disconnected. He's just rejoining it. Hi, you're on mute. You're on
Yes.
mute. Okay.
Hi. Sorry, I got disconnected for some reason. Um, but yes, sir. So newly hatched pythons or many newly hatched reptiles can be difficult to feed. One of the most important things to do while when reptiles are young is to give them security of some sort. So, for example, with baby pythons, it's very important to give them some place to hide, and they are ambush predators as well. So they'll wait for prey to come close to them, uh, and once they start feeding, they're dustbins. They'll keep taking whatever you give them.
Uh,
Sorry, can I talk, please?
Yes.
Yeah, very good evening.
Good evening.
Actually, what are the feed we can give? Like newly has mice, uh,
So
newly has chicks, but we have tried, but they're not taking actually. So that's why I'm.
Okay, so chicks are not really great food for them. Ideally, mice would be great. So, but they should also be able to eat. Um, these are rock pythons, right? So,
Yes,
like even an
proper.
adult mouse, not a rat, an adult mouse, will be fine for them to eat.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay. Can
and try
we
to
do
keep them
post feed?
separate, not together. If they are,
Okay.
keep them in individual enclosures,
Okay.
and give each of them, a place to hide. Pythons like a lot of water, so make sure that they have enough, a nice water dish and everything, and also temperature. They should have a place to bask, and shouldn't be kept in a dark room or anything like that. Give them a good daylight cycle.
Okay. And provide live mice. So that.
Yes, but if you're providing live mice or anything, it's important to observe and not just leave the mouse in, because sometimes rodents will also attack uh, the babies.
Okay. Fine.
uh, Upasna Rai is having question. Could you kindly suggest husbandry practices for common sandboa?
The common sandboa is
Yeah.
actually a very easy animal to keep, but it's not a great exhibit. It's under the sand most of the time, but it needs an option for very high temperatures. And I would put the basking light and a place for it to bask near 40, 42 degrees as well. Um, but so it doesn't need to drink too much water, but it needs to have, a slightly humid but not damp space. If it's a damp space, then what will happen is it'll get infections very quickly. And sandboas, if it's an adult, they will feed on rodents and small birds. If it's a young one, then they feed on lizards and reptiles as well. So ideally, you should have an adult and be feeding it a mice, but give it the warmth that it needs. It's very important. And use sand, not mud. Sorry. Yeah, it's important for you to use sand so it's easier to clean.
Dr. Jacob Alexander is asking, great presentation. Can you explain what exactly one should do when a king cobra has bitten his keeper in our country?
So, doctor, unfortunately, we don't have an anti-venom for king cobras in our country, especially if we've researched, we've tested the venom of our South Indian king cobras against existing anti-venoms from Thailand, but they don't work. Having said that, and we don't have much time either. When a king cobra bites, because it has so much venom, it can act, and death can come quite quickly. So it's important to have all the backup, like a ventilator and things like that, in the zoo itself. We are hoping to be able to develop a king cobra antivenom primarily because it's not a medically significant snake for general public, but since so many zoos have them and rescuers are catching them regularly now, we're hoping that one of the antivenom manufacturers will actually uh, create antivenom for king cobras.
Can you elaborate more on the snake bite and the venom?
So in case of snake bite, it's very important to a few things that are really important to do and not to do. Firstly, as soon as someone's bitten by a snake, uh, it's important to take charge of the situation and then remove anything that might become a constraint. So if there are rings, watches, bangles, kadas, anything that might get tight in case the limb swells up. So you remove those things and then you immobilize the limb. The bites are usually on the arms, hands, or feet and legs. So you immobilize the limb, but without tying anything tight. So if it's on the arm, you find a shawl or a towel or anything and create a sling. Ideally, keep the site of the bite below the heart and go straight to hospital. If it's on the leg, if the person can be put on a stretcher, ideal, or carried, great. But if not, then at least support the patient so that they don't have to put any weight on the leg. Don't tie a splint, even though that's what's recommended in many textbooks. Splints can cause a lot more problem, because unless it's tied very well and pressure is released regularly, it could cause a lot more trouble and even be fatal. It's very important not to cut the wound, burn the wound, wash it. You cannot suck out the venom. So don't do any of those other things. Get straight to hospital. But as far as snake bite goes, if we're working with venomous snakes regularly, we should have a protocol in place for contingencies like this. And what I recommend is have a highly visible printed protocol with everything that you need for first aid in a space that is accessible, and keepers, biologists, and anyone else who's relevant needs to be trained in the first aid as well, so that this can be done well, and that could be in the difference between the loss of limb or even life. Sorry, you're muted, Apurva.
Yeah, sorry. As many of us zoos have venomous snakes in captivity, and managing them gets a bit tricky sometimes. So, what are your suggestions for the regular keepers who have continuously have to go inside the enclosure to clean? Do the keeper always have to remove the snake while cleaning? What are your suggestions for
So
keepers
it
specifically?
depends on which snake it is. Ideally, being in the same space as a king cobra, especially if the space is not too big, is not a good idea. We can use various things like shields, boots, or I think the best thing is to have a hide box that gets put into the enclosure. The snake is put into that, and with a sliding door, the hide box is shut. And then the keeper doesn't have to worry about the snake at all. There's a thorough cleaning, and then you just open the hide box, and then the snake comes out, and you take the hide box out. If it's possible, if these are new enclosures, then I would integrate that into the design of the enclosure itself. So have a place that can be opened from the outside, and the snake can be chased or put into that thing and shut, and then the exhibit or the enclosure can be cleaned very effectively and safely.
Thank you so much, sir. Swapnil Acharji is asking, thanks for such a great talk. My question is a little off topic from keeping reptiles in the captivity. The ARRS King Cobra telemetry study gives us insight about how snakes have a certain home range and have trouble surviving when they are relocated. Apart from that study, has there been any studies done that look into estimating what are the area size of home range for different species of snakes in India?
So we've actually done one on Russell's vipers, and we found that male Russell's vipers have a very small home range, about 1.6 square kilometers. Females have an even smaller home range. Some are as small as 0.4 square kilometers. So, and when we say the home range with snakes, it's not really the entire area of that polygon. They have very small circuitous areas within that space as well that they use. So and the site fidelity that they have is very high in Russell's vipers. One female went back to the same cement pipe under a road to litter for 3 years in a row. So it's we still have a lot to learn about snakes. There's a fair amount of work that's been done internationally, but and also the other thing with snakes is it's very difficult to say that snakes have these things or snakes behave like this, because it's the same thing as saying birds do X, Y, and Z. And there's a huge diversity of birds. There's also a huge diversity of snakes, and many of them are very specialized. And each species has its own permutations and combinations of what is required and how they live and their biology and ecology. But hopefully, we'll be doing a lot more research in the next few years. I know that there's some other telemetry work that's been done by WII on pythons, hoping to see the publication soon. There's some work being done on pit vipers. So there will be more and more information that comes out over the next few years.
So many of the snake friends have this general practice of catching it from some household where they have get the rescue calls, and they have tendency to leave it in some another place, which may be far, not necessarily in the vicinity. So is that a good practice then?
So relocation is actually not a good practice. It's not a conservation practice at all. And ideally, snakes should be removed from the situation. So if it's inside a house, they should be released, removed and put outside the house. Otherwise, there is a very high chance that the snake will, when I say a very high chance, some studies that have been done have shown that it's almost 100% mortality of snakes once they're relocated. How far they can be moved, which species can deal with it, which species can't. That there's a lot of research that's still to be done. But so far, everything that has been done has shown that relocation has a lot of ill effects on the snake itself. Also, when we're relocating to another place, very often they're relocated into protected areas and things like that, which I think is a very negative practice because it's affecting pristine ecosystems. So I think we should try not to do that, and education and coexistence is very important.
Thank you. Nikhil is asking, thank you for taking us through the presentation. Are there any ways to measure how a snake lizard responds to different type of enrichment and captivity?
There's a lot of interesting studies that have been done. Professor Harvey Lillywhite has done a lot of work on behavioral ecology, and if you can translate those into looking at captive scenarios as well, things like tongue flicking, he's got various casual indexes looking at how snakes are or lizards are, um, calm, how they respond to stimulus, And even looking at things like, the stress hormones, cortisol in their feces and things like that. So there's a lot of, it depends on what question you're asking exactly. The methodology for assessing it would be different.
Okay. SPZP director is asking, please elaborate on the subspecies of king cobra, as this was a major finding during the breeding program in 1996, to which I facilitated from CZA at that point of time.
Hello, sir. So basically, king cobras are now, it's not subspecies, but they're different species, sir. They've been found to, a huge group of scientists, actually, herpetologists, have gotten together from different parts of the world, and through both morphometrics and DNA analyses, have found that right now they've just published a paper that have pointed out 4 different species. India has 2 of them. And then there's one in Malaysia, the Malayan archipelago and peninsula, and then one far, I think it's in Sulawesi. Uh, but um, but I feel that there might be more with further sampling. In India, we have 2. One is now being called Ophiophagus kalinga, which is found in the Western Ghats, and then Ophiophagus hana is the type locality which extends from West Bengal to northern India and slightly east of northeast India and slightly east of there as well. And the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, yeah. So I think, but I think it, these have very pertinent conservation implications, so they shouldn't be crossbred. But also, now that the Western Ghat species is a different species, it is an isolated one and needs higher levels of protection as well.
Experience, what are the key differences between managing snakes in captivity versus in their wild habitat?
I didn't understand that question.
What are the key differences in managing reptiles in the captivity, like managing temperature, their habitat,
Okay.
versus when you study them in the wider habitat?
Okay. So I think when we study them in the wild, what's really becoming very clear to us is that many of the things that we thought we knew are assumptions, and they need to be, I mean, we need a lot more research. Uh, and Research involves, unfortunately, with things like snakes, is very cumbersome and tedious because it most often involves radiotelemetry. With some species of crocodiles, you can do, just observational research. But even things like turtles and all will require radio telemetry, and it's not easy to do these things. They're expensive. It takes a long time, and but these are the things that we really need to do to be able to facilitate better husbandry practices in zoos. Um, and I think there's also, I think there's a lot of research that can be done in zoos as well, to look at simple things like the kind of temperature brackets or niches that the animals prefer. Look at dietary research to understand what they prefer eating. Compare that with wild research. So I think there are differences in maintaining them in captivity and studying them in the wild. But I think if the two come together, then we'd be able to create a better understanding of these animals much faster. Uh, Wild researchers lack the perspective of captivity, and captive keepers lack the behavioral and ecological perspectives of wild researchers get. So it'll be good to combine the two and get some truly deep and substantial answers.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from participants? You can unmute yourself and be free to ask questions. I hope Nikhil got his answer. So, there seems to be no more questions. It was very interesting and two-way session. Can I proceed with the vote of thanks? Thank you everyone for tuning in for this insightful episode of Zooming Conservation. A special thank you to Jared Martin for sharing his incredible experience and expertise and deep passion for reptile conservation. To our listeners, we appreciate your ongoing support and interest in wildlife conservation. We hope this episode has shed light on the vital work that has been done conservation of reptiles and managing their well-being in captivity and in wild. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to explore the world of conservation with experts who are making the difference. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.